Hello, my name is Kabir and welcome to the Sweets podcast called The Inside Tour of a Scientist. Have you ever wondered what famous people did when they were kids? Today, I'm going to interview one of the fathers of genomics, Professor George Church. Professor Church is a professor at Harvard University and is working with his team to revive extinct animals using gene editing. Now, I will ask him a few questions.
What did you do when you were young to make you a great scientist?
I didn't know any scientists. I had really very little idea about what it was other than reading or looking at pictures in a few books because I was dyslexic, had trouble reading. I lived on the water most of my youth, and I got interested in the crustaceans and the echinoderms in the mud. And my father was a physician, and so I was also interested in his medical bag. Back then, physicians would do house calls where they'd carry around a little black bag. It would open up and it'd be full of drugs and syringes and needles. Anyway, I was fascinated by all this gear and the inventions that must have lay behind it. And I just decided that I would start learning science. I guess the third thing that influenced me, aside from the mud and the doctor's bag, and the third thing was that there was a World's Fair in New York City or Queens nearby that in 1964 that was pretty awe-inspiring. It was intentionally designed by multiple countries to represent the best and the brightest of their technology. So those were the three things that made me want to do a good job.
Describe something you did in elementary school or after school that was different from other people.
There was one unusual thing I did. So like I said, I was a dyslexic. I had trouble with reading, and so I was often advised to take remedial reading courses. And one of them I took was a night course that it was kind of a mixed course with mostly adults that were taking it after they got done with work. They would go to this class, and I had never realized that people went to class voluntarily. You know, I had to go to class, and here are all these people that worked hard all day, and then they worked some more at this reading class. And many of them were remedial reading like me, but a few of them were doing speed reading in the same class. It was this gigantic classroom full of people doing different things in different parts of the room. And some of them were doing speed reading where they had a machine that would like flash words on the screen. And I discovered that even though I was terrible at reading, I was really good at this kind of seeing the things flash, probably because I was the youngest person in the room, and just reflexes of young people are often quite good, as you probably know, and just a lot of things, you know, you're young. Anyway, so I that made me think differently about my reading problems. So anyway, that was something that I don't think anybody else in my class was in an adult night class.
Tell me about a science project that you did in school that inspired you.
We did have a science fair project, and I built an analog computer. I didn't know anything about computers, but I got an electrician to help me put together some parts to make an analog computer. And then in 10th grade, or maybe it was 9th, I did a kind of independent project where I tried to use gibberellic acid or gibberellic acid. I can't remember how it's pronounced, but it's a plant hormone that causes them to grow long. And so I did it on bean plants, which was kind of the textbook thing to do. And then I also did it on Venus flytraps, trying to get like a giant carnivorous plant. And it worked pretty well on the bean plants. Fortunately, it didn't work on the Venus flytrap.
What happens to Venus flytrap?
Oh, it just stayed small. It didn't really. I don't think it had a growth pattern that was subject to the plant hormone. But it was worth a try. That's the thing about science, is if you don't fail, you're not trying very hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I failed many times.
Could you please tell me about a person or a book that motivated you to become a scientist?
Like I said, I wasn't really good at reading, but I did have a few biographies that I think my mom would buy me. And one was on Luther Burbank, Marie Curie, and Edison. I particularly liked Luther Burbank because he had a tree where he had grafted maybe 100 different species onto the same tree. So this tree had all different kinds of fruit. It just looked like, how can this be, you know? And so I went, as soon as I read that in the book, I went out in my backyard and I started grafting. I just started putting, and they worked. You know, you could cut a branch off of one tree and put on another tree and it would work. That blew me away. It just never occurred to me that would be a possibility.
So you would take one branch off and put it on another tree and it would work?
Well, I think I started by taking one branch off the same tree and put it, you know, just and that worked. And I think I got a little bored after that. I'm not bored. I just get distracted.
What good science books do you recommend to kids my age?
Well, I'm assuming you're a much better reader than I am. Definitely a mixture of biography, because biography kind of tells you how they got to where they were, and maybe experiments. You know, books that describe experiments you can do, because I think that yeah, there's too much abstraction in our lives these days. I mean, you should need a little abstraction, but you need a little bit of like building something you can be proud of at the end of the day. So I was proud of my analog computer, and I was proud of that graph, and I helped my mom take care of her orchids, and you know, these are all things, you know, like used to be we were all farmers and hunters and gatherers. I think you need to do something, so some combination of somebody's story, something abstract like math, and then something concrete.
Describe a time you discovered something you did not know before.
There's so many of them, but I can describe the first one that I can remember. The first one was, well, first two. First one, I stuck an aluminum fork from my sister's playset into the wall socket, and I discovered that I could melt the fork without hurting myself. But the second thing was a little longer story, a little more interesting. Like I said, I like the insects in my backyard, and so we had a little pond, and I would look through, I would just stare at the pond, stare and stare. And one day I saw something that looked really scary. I mean, it was small, but it was scary, and it was you know, it looked like a predator, and indeed it was predator. And so I scooped up a bunch it with some pond muck into a glass jar, and screwed on the lid and put it on my shelf. And yeah, a couple days later, I came back to check out my monster, and it was gone. And I was very, very disappointed. You know, like you know, I had never seen anything like that. So it was already a discovery just to see this crazy thing. But then I wanted to know where it went, because it was in a sealed container. I mean, where could it go? It could have died and rotted that quickly, but I didn't believe that. So I looked, so I carefully unscrewed it, and I saw in the top, in the lid, was a dragonfly. And I said, that's weird. How did the dragonfly get into the jar and the monster get out of the jar? And I said, I could kind of imagine the monster eating the dragonfly, but couldn't really imagine the dragonfly going down into the water and finding this thing. And so it was a real mystery to me. But I decided to go to the library and try to figure it out. And this was a real epiphany for me, just as big an epiphany or a discovery as these bugs. was that I could do research. I mean, that was a new idea for me at this age, but I knew I could. I went to the library, and again, I did it mostly by pictures, but I found a picture of both the dragonfly and the monster on the same page. And so then I was highly motivated to, as hard as it was, to read that page and figure out what was going on. And it turned out that the predator was a larval form of the dragonfly called a nymph. And a nymph makes it sound much too friendly. It really looked scary, and it turns out it is a predator. And anyway, so that I learned about metamorphosis, and it just still blows my mind that something that looks like a water beast can turn into this beautiful, delicate flying thing. Hard to believe they're the same. It's like, you are not going to look that different. I mean, I don't look that different now than when I was your age, right? I didn't. It's not like I underwent metamorphosis or anything. Okay, so that was my discovery.
Thank you so much, Professor Church, for letting me interview you. I have had so much fun listening to your answers, and your answers were really inspiring to me. Thank you for listening, and see you next time. Are you listeners done listening to this podcast? Let's hear what Professor Church has to say about his journey.
I'm not even half done yet. I'm just getting warmed up.